right. Right, comrades, welcome everybody to today's session. We're discussing today a very, very peculiar country, a country which was settled by migrants a few centuries ago who had been persecuted or impoverished in their own countries, who then migrated to this new continent. And a little bit like Israel, they subjected the native population to dispossession and, in fact, to virtual extinction in the process. And then later, they had a substantial minority, or there is already a substantial minority, whose ancestors were abducted, forcibly transported, and enslaved in that country. It's a country which, on the basis of an inexhaustible supply, therefore, of cheap labor and vast resources, came to dominate the world for at least a century. A country where today a president can whip up a mob to storm the legislature, to mount a coup in order to, in the failed bid to retain power, and who still retains mass support. A country where 53 people a day on average die of gunshot wounds, and where police kill 3 people per day. A country where children are scared of the real threat of being massacred in their classrooms. A country where half the population expect an imminent civil war. Perhaps in any other circumstances, a country which you'd characterize as a failed state. But at the same time, it's a country which dominates all our lives worldwide because of its enormous economic and military power. So we're very pleased to welcome today Comrade Jack Gerson, who's a veteran socialist and trade union militant in the USA. And I'm happy to hand over to him now. Welcome, Jack.
Thanks, Roger. Roger asked me to speak this weekend. I told him that I was willing to, but that there were certain limitations because I've been teaching high school up until in Alameda, California, next door to Oakland. The school year ended 3 days ago. And I am drained and have been for months. This is the hardest school year that I or other teachers have faced. And I'm going to describe some of the conditions because they're directly related to what Roger was saying about what I call the unraveling of the U.S. Ruling class consensus, the unraveling of society based on a crumbling infrastructure and a generally failing approach to its dominant for decades leadership of the capitalist world, its ability to stand unchallenged in preserving and guaranteeing the continued profiting of the bondholders and corporations. So. Roger began the blurb that he wrote for this meeting with a quote from Trotsky, but I think there are a couple of other quotes from, if we're going to quote Trotsky, that are really relevant to the US. And one of them was that the American working class is going to pay a steep penalty for its pragmatism, for its failure to organize a political party of the working class, and that we in the world were already in the 1930s paying a steep price for the rise of fascism because of the failure to overthrow the capitalist order previously. And what we're seeing now is as the order continues, there is increasing fragility and danger and reaction in the U.S. as the order falls apart. And this is affecting, I think, everything. I think it's affecting the educational system. I'm going to talk about this a little bit now, what I saw, where I think it's coming from, and then try to go beyond there a bit. But I'm going to keep it short, and I'm hoping that there are others here. You know, I know Steve is here from the U.S. They hopefully will chime in with something about the hopeful side, the organizing Amazon and Starbucks workers unions, the organizing of technology workers, and the ability to hopefully crack into the gig economy, the big warehouses, and actually present a real mass movement that'll regenerate and, if necessary, rebuild the trade union movement and lead the working class in the U.S. And hopefully help the world working class to take power in what is increasingly a situation where that must happen if civilization is going to survive, I think. Across the U.S., I'll put it this way: when I returned to teaching this year, which is the fourth time in 5 years that I've taken a long-term assignment, I thought I've never seen anything like this, and it must be my age. The fact that I am completely drained and feel like a zombie when I come home. And it must be the fact that I'm 75. I'll be 76 in a couple of weeks. Then I talked to other teachers, and I talked to a young teacher who wanted to know what can she do. She was working 20 hours a day, barely sleeping, and was unable to do anything but prepare materials, teach, and try to deal with those conditions. Then I talked to a veteran teacher, one of the best, I teach math, one of the best math teachers that I've known. And she initiated the discussion saying, how are you finding your classes? Because she said, I work every night for hours trying to get really enthusiastic. I'm going to come in and the students are going to really get engaged with what I'm developing. And then she said, I come in and they stare at me with blank eyes, completely passively and unengaged. And that's what I have found. And that is amid probably, well, definitely the highest level of requests from counselors, psychologists, and so on for accommodations for students. There is a very large number of students in my classes, and this is true in the whole school and the school district and the region and nationally, are suicidal, autistic, stressed, and at best, very fearful and uncertain about their future and what the world holds for them, with global warming over their heads, with the Trump and those who are behind him looming. So there's just tremendously much more than I've seen mental health issues in the schools among students and demoralization among teachers. And this is something which is going to directly affect, it's not just some commentary for a magazine article. This directly affects our ability to organize and fight. People, I think, know about the Red States uprising 3 years ago when teachers in West Virginia, in Oklahoma, in Arizona, in Kentucky, rose up outside, for the most part, of their union structures and waged and then forced, in many cases, the unions to follow them, and fought heroically against the horrendous conditions that were being imposed in those states, against the cuts, against attacks on healthcare, against the tax on pensions, against layoffs, and so on. And in West Virginia, in particular, the red state teachers there would not accept a settlement unless that settlement applied to all public workers in the state. It was very inspiring. There were 2 or 3 main leaders. Among them, maybe the most prominent was a woman named Nicole Mccormick. Nicole McCormick came to Oakland 3 years ago when there were teachers from Arizona, Kentucky, and West Virginia, and was one of the people who spoke to several hundred of us. So I was really shocked and depressed when a few weeks ago I read in Rethinking Schools magazine an article that began with Nicole McCormick leaving teaching because of the conditions that she faced this year, because she was so demoralized. And after 10 or 11 years of teaching, in which she had gotten awards and stuff for teaching, as well as being one of the leading union militants in those heroic struggles, and had maintained her activism afterwards, became completely demoralized by what she faced in the classroom every day, by the demoralization, by the mental health problems that she was facing, by the inability to engage and really feel like there was interaction and learning going on with her students, and by the conditions that had been that were imposed, the conditions which have always been bad. There was an opportunity with the pandemic to turn things around, because there was supposed to be 6-foot distancing, which require more teachers and or smaller classes and so on when we return from distance learning and hybrid learning. To have those conditions would mean that you could really begin, particularly in the schools with students of highest need, to work on a more individual basis with students. Small class size is found to be the highest correlate of successful increase in achievement, especially in schools with in the poorest neighborhoods. And that's been found. Peter Blatchford's group at the Institute of Education in London has done the best work on that. But instead, what we got was less support. We got larger classes. We don't have 6-inch distancing where I taught. 3 classes, 33, 35, and 35 students. Now, that is with no instructional aids. I'm not sure what it's like in areas where others are. I know that in South Africa, you have in the Eastern Cape, you have classes up to 70, but that's completely failed. Under the conditions of large classes with students in need of much more help, where we've had multiple surges of the virus through the year, and many cases spreading and surging through schools, affecting students and teachers, then the priority clearly had to be turning conditions around, but it wasn't. And instead, what we got was not only larger classes, but more demands and more work piled on, and more edicts coming down from administration, more unrealistic goals, and so teachers facing students who, with these demands, I guess that I should put one more, say one more thing for the context. there was education was suspended essentially in March of 2020, and there was no real education for the rest of that school year, which effectively blotted that school year out for students who were in the 9th grade and beyond. Well, in all grades. The following year, 2021-22, there was mainly distance learning and hybrid learning. And I can tell you that that was a complete failure because I taught in the spring of 2021. And it was, the classes met half as frequently as in a regular school year. And they were supposed to be at twice the pace, because a year, for example, of Algebra 1 was being done, and all math courses was being done in a semester. And since the classes met half as often, that meant that it was 4 times the pace. However, all of this was done through distance learning, which is a failure. And so you have now students who went for a year and a half, which really means 2 school years, with essentially no learning. Now, in some areas, like say in literature and even perhaps in history, you can go forward. In courses in math and many science courses, you can't, because they build on each other. And so we now have a group of students who are being pushed forward and who have basically not only not attained the basic content, but are moving backwards in it. But the academic part is the smallest part of it, because students spent a year and a half at home and not engaged in school, and basically on the web. During the distance learning, students were basically off and doing what they wanted. So in my classes this year, and in all teachers' classes, whatever was going on in teaching, whether you were teaching from the front or you were trying to coach and so on, what students were interested in doing was what they'd been doing for a year and a half, which is being engaged on the web in their own activity. So the socialization, which is really critical, I think, wasn't taking place. Now, this is for high school students, but what was it like for elementary school students and kindergarten students, who the youngest, who did not have an opportunity to socialize for so long? There was a real, I think, deficiency, which I think is directly related to the mental health issues that we've seen. Now, factor into it that the president, for 4 years, including the first year of the pandemic, Donald Trump, was who he is. And that is a role model for the youngest kids and society, a role model of someone who is a narcissistic, solipsistic liar. And to me, those are the conditions that we face, the immediate conditions. Now, I want to say that these conditions were there because, in the form they are, because of 45 to 50 years of neoliberalism, structural adjustment, which battered down the public sector through privatization, downsizing, austerity, charter schools, whose goal was to disrupt education in a similar way to which the Silicon Valley disrupted, attempted to disrupt, and to a large degree did disrupt the conditions of the working class. So the aim of these was especially breaking the largest unions in the country or weakening them, or getting them to collaborate. That is the teacher unions, the National Education Association, the NEA, and the American Federation of Teachers, the AFT. And this was a conscious attack that and well planned and orchestrated by the capitalist class. In around 1971-72, there were, starting actually at the end of the post-war boom in 69-70, there were a series of editorials in the tabloid press in New York, especially, saying that the private sector is being strangled by the public sector. The private sector can't afford to pay for social services. It can't afford the taxes, and something has to be done with it. The Economic Development Council of New York, which was essentially the sitting committee of the bourgeoisie with the heads of Texaco, Exxon, New York Telephone, which was the largest affiliate of AT&T, New York Life, Metropolitan Life, and so on, put out glossy brochures about this, and then sent teams into the school headed by the Ford Foundation and its education director, Mario Fantini, into junior high schools in Manhattan to prove that teacher preparation time and class size had nothing to do with student achievement. In other words, you could cut teacher preparation time in half and increase the number of students in the class, and it wouldn't hurt student achievement. That was an explicit attack. While that one was temporarily stopped for a year or two because the teacher union did oppose that, it manifested itself again and much more strongly 3 years later in 1975 in the New York City fiscal crisis, which people may know. David Harvey and others call this dress rehearsal for neoliberalism, in which the city was bankrupted by the big banks. Refused to renew the loans, to give the city bridge loans. The federal government under President Gerald Ford not only turned its back on the city, but the Treasury Secretary William Simon made his statement was, "We're going to teach this city a lesson so that no city again ever tries to go where this city did." What did he mean by that? He meant that New York was providing moderate social network, something pale even compared to Scandinavian social welfare, or British for that matter, but that it was unacceptable to put money into hospitals and welfare, education, and so on in the city, and that had to be attacked directly head on. And that was that's been called a dress rehearsal for neoliberalism. Of course, neoliberalism was by that time raging outside of the U.S. in Jamaica and elsewhere in the world. But in the U.S., that was an opening gun. It was followed 3 years later, in 1978. The Democrat Jimmy Carter, in the second half of his administration, with his trilateralism and the appointment of Paul Volcker, who was to institute the Volcker shock, interest rate rise, which almost caused close to causing a world depression, certainly dramatically affected Mexico. And coming out of all this was an orchestrated campaign against especially education as the wedge to attack all of public services. I'm not going to go through it. I have an article, a book chapter actually on the neoliberal agenda and the response of teacher unions, which goes through in detail what was done. But I think there are one or two important points, and I don't want to speak much longer, but one of them is the attack on public education was a bipartisan attack by the Democrats and the Republicans. The most enthusiastic, in fact, for the No Child Left Behind legislation, which was basically the enabling legislation for charter schools and school closures, were Senator Ted Kennedy and the even more perhaps liberal Representative George Miller from the Bay Area. And they were especially enthusiastic about not only charter schools, but paying teachers based on student test scores, high stakes testing, so that the schools that were closed were the schools predominantly, disproportionately in high poverty areas, low income areas, especially, the Black community, because the highest correlate of educational achievement is zip code, is affluence level. And the poorest communities, you would have the lowest achievement for issues often not related, social issues, in terms of what the students lacked. Students, many homeless, and living in group homes, out in the streets, no access to libraries, and so on. And the schools were run down, underfunded in the US. In even moderately affluent communities, there are private funds that supplement the money for schools and pay for teacher aides, librarians, and services, extracurricular activities. In the ghetto schools, they are completely underfunded, dirty, and so on. And the model that was then implemented was an entrepreneurial model in which schools were given an inadequate amount of money and told on a decentralized basis, you have to show profit. Eli Broad, the Los Angeles billionaire who was one of the main architects of the billionaire's assault on public education, Eli Broad called school districts large corporations, and schools profit centers, and students revenue sources. And so in order to show a profit, the school districts eliminated central services to a very large degree. Schools were told, and this was true in my school, that for example, by California State Education Code, every classroom had to have a telephone. We were told the district no longer provides them, go to Radio Shack. Copying, go to Kinko's and pay privately, but we're not getting money from you to do this. This was a general approach. What did the teacher unions do about this?
Yeah, sorry to interrupt you, but if you could give it another 5 minutes or so, is that okay?
Yeah, I'll try to do it less than that, but probably won't. But I'll make it in 5 minutes. The position of the teacher unions, essentially, like the labor movement in general, was to embrace the team concept of a collaboration between management in private enterprise, the bosses, and the unions. In education, the CTA, the California State Affiliate of the NEA, for example, supported for the California State Commissioner of Education, State Superintendent of Public Instruction, one man named Jack O'Connell. They gave him $100,000. O'Connell got $500,000 from Eli Broad, Reed Hastings, who was the CEO of Netflix and came out of Pure Software in the Silicon Valley. And the third was John Doerr, who was the biggest venture capitalist in the Silicon Valley, provided initial funding to Amazon and Google. O'Connell proceeded to turn around and essentially put Oakland into state receivership. When Oakland was put into state receivership, it closed a large number of schools. The charter school population went from 2,000 to 8,000 in 3 years and is now over 15,000, over 30% charter schools, battered down public instruction. The CTA supported Jack O'Connell when he ran for re-election. California is run lock, stock, and barrel by the Democrats, but there has been no move by CTA against it. And I'm gonna, since I'm not gonna have enough time to do much more, I'm gonna basically, I'll close with this. It seems to me that there's only one way forward for the world. Right now, the society in the US seems to be visibly falling apart. And that leads to a panic, especially you see the forces behind Trump are reacting to it. To a large degree, those are failed small business owners and other small business owners, and some lumpen elements, but it also includes a number of workers who, through deindustrialization, particularly the Rust Belt, have lost everything. And people need to know, what are we going to do for the future? How can we move forward for our future? And if we don't provide a way forward, they're going to look in another direction. So, and this, it relates to, and there's not forever, because the clock is ticking. These crises and catastrophes are interacting with one another. Global warming and climate change interacts with the refugee crisis. It's going to get immeasurably worse with the rising sea levels, and also areas of the world where people will no longer be able to live, which is going to include desert areas which have been populated in the US, like the Las Vegas area, for example, in Arizona. Things are going to get immeasurably worse. We have to be providing a way forward for this. In order to provide a way forward, we have to begin by looking at what's been crumbling, and we're the force that can, we the international working class, can change things. It has to be, I think, through understanding that we can't rebuild a flourishing system in which all workers are going to thrive, working people, but we have to fight for what working people need, starting in my case with, I think with education and the crumbling infrastructure, decent jobs, and so on, and making it clear that we can only win that by reorganizing society from top to bottom, and domestically and internationally. I'm going to stop there. I could talk for hours and probably just diffuse more, so I'll stop.
Well, thank you very much, Jack. That's a very, very interesting, and it showed the impact of the crisis in American society, particularly in your field in education, but it also opens up the discussion. I'm glad to see there are several comrades here who are from the USA or living in the USA, so I hope that they'll also supplement your lead off with.
I hope they will too. I'm counting on their speaking about what's going on now. Which,
and of course, you'll have opportunity to come back into the discussion and to sum up at the end.
Sure.
So thank you very much, Jack. Who was going to speak first? Questions or supplementary points or whatever you like. Matthew.
Hi, comrades. Yeah, thank you for that introduction. Obviously, we face, as you say, a gross crisis. A point, where the word crisis doesn't really describe the depths to which we are descending, and of course the fact that the system itself is actually disintegrating. In all ways, economically, politically, socially, we are reaching this point. Where things are actually falling apart. Most clearly, of course, in the US, as you say, as the global hegemon, the deciding point. It's if you like, the privilege of the US working class is to face the ruling class of the US, which dominates the world, even in the conditions at the moment, as we can see, where that domination itself is under serious threat, and therefore their answer to this, of course, is war. This is the problem, of course, as well. It's both, as you say, a historic savagery. Which of course the US working classes, or the US ruling classes, always had actually this really savage tendency internally. At the same time, the fact that it has maintained its domination of the rest of the world through almost permanent war, which it of course is ramping up. It now intends to run a war with China, which is effectively World War III. That is their plan. That's what they want to do. And the question is, how do we stop this? So it is the questions of imperialism, as well as you say, of the state of US society, and historically, as you say, the questions really also now we come down to the point of the disintegration of the forms of democracy in the US, whereby obviously Trump intends to stage a coup. The forces behind him, which are not merely the sort of fascist sweepings, etc., which were used, but all the forces of the state, both politically and in terms of the state machine, which supported that move. And we see the sort of farce that we're getting now, in terms of the hearings around the January 6th attempted coup, the auto golpe, is that they concentrate on the fascist sweepings, to the exception of the political forces who are still sitting there, Trump himself, and the pieces of the state machine who supported him. The fact that the state actually cleared the way for these people to invade the capital. You see, people have drawn the contrast between, what happened with Black Lives Matter a few months previously, in which, people had no interest in overthrowing the state, were bludgeoned off the street and, threatened with all sorts of, had all manners of projectiles fired at them, compared to what happened with a load of fascist-led mob who were allowed to walk in, effectively to walk into the capital of the imperialist hegemon. It's incredible. The fact that now we have a situation in which the society is being run from an unelected Supreme Court. The thing itself is actually going down the tube, and that of course then has a huge significance for the rest of the world as well. All this sort of nonsense, human rights and democracy and all this kind of stuff. It nakedly. It goes back through history, as you say, in terms of the state of democracy in the US has never been particularly brilliant, but it's getting to the point where it's clearly just falling off the perch. I think the other thing is in terms of the state, as you say, of the question of the state of the working class. The impact of the move. You did detail the move, from the early 70s, which goes wider than me sort of attack upon the whole issue of social services and so on and so forth in the earth. That actually what you see is a move away from the classic capitalism of which the Cold War system towards finance capital, and the move to essentially, which is signalled by the end of the Bretton Woods system in '71, the move to finance capital is exactly the same, and that actually tracks the whole thing, and it comes through, as you say, in terms of internally in the US, but also in world terms. And that's the significance of Thatcherism here. It's the significance, as you say, also of the Volcker shock of Reagan and so on, and the destruction of the working class and the manufacturing base. At the same time, of course, imperils the US ruling class itself. In fact, it has demolished it's much of its own economic base, and is now nakedly parasitic. Both particularly here in the UK and also the US, the ruling class is nakedly parasitic upon the rest of the world, which then leaves it in many ways in a much weaker position, and with a disintegrating system. And I think the other point I would make, I mean, obviously, as you say, you've gone for hours about this, is the use at the moment of the union bureaucracy. This is a critical point of control, is the use of the union bureaucracy to control the working class. And over and over again, what we're seeing is this layer, of course, which is now integrated, I mean, fully integrated into the systems of the state, is being used as a control mechanism. Nakedly so in, say, the United Auto Workers Union, which they've been bought, I mean, effectively bought by the management. I mean, there's a whole series of cases basically saying when they've given millions of dollars, and essentially in order to control the auto workers and allow the bosses to do what the hell they wanted. But that's the same for all the unions. I mean, this is the problem you've got, is this layer. And we have, it's the same all over. It's how actually does the working class actually dispose of this layer of people, which is now being nakedly used against it. And this is,
Matthew.
I think this is going to be a key development. Thank you.
Yep, thank you. Yeah, David.
Yeah, thanks, Jack, particularly for coming on board and sharing some real insights into the crisis, particularly in the education sector. And can I say, with a close relative of mine in a quote unquote private or religious school, things are even worse than you've described, because union rates just don't apply. And the class sizes during the height of the pandemic were 20 plus 20. In other words, 20 that turned up and 20 that were online. And, these kids just couldn't keep up with the online stuff and were falling asleep or anyway, it's a real struggle. And she was, I won't show you a picture of her, but she literally would collapse when she'd come home. She would just fall down. And that was it for about 45 minutes before she could regain her strength. So look, it's exhaustion for sections of the working class and sections of the, well, it's hard to say middle class, because being a teacher is hardly middle class now. It's industrial labor, and and it's only ameliorated or softened by the fact there's lovely kids, and they, such hope and such plurality too, you see, which is, I have to say that despite all the setbacks that we've seen, in most places I've been, I haven't seen, well, let me not say, I haven't seen any form of racist abuse, and there are people close to me who are, in the family who are Black, and they've mentioned this too. So look, society does advance. At the same time, now we're seeing all the social conditions declining. And then that brings back the force of, the rising of the right, despite its entanglements and its confusion and its semi-suicidal aspects. So what we've seen now in the last couple of days, if I could go on with a broad picture, is the attempt of the ruling class to reestablish its norms of governance. I mean, it's extraordinary. I don't know if comrades have seen the TV showings, and there's more to come. of the investigation, into the 6th of January uprising, or it wasn't really, it was an attempt to, well, let's make it very clear, whatever it was an attempt to get hold of those ballots, to burn them, to destroy them, and to then declare that Trump was still president. That's whatever pronoun or noun you give to that, that's actually what took place. And there's an attempt to do that, and it nearly succeeded. And still now, large chunks of one of the main parties still believes that there was a complete illegal outcome, to the election. Absolutely amazing, because in America, it does have quite high democratic norms, or at least has had, so that there is an election just about for every single public office, in the area I am. And that's quite surprising if you know Britain or South Africa, where that's certainly not the case. So there are all kinds of democratic norms, and they're being crushed and crashed, all the time. So we're seeing a kind of a democratic counter-revolution. Partly, why I say democratic, because it's not always a gun in the face, although that's threatened, all the time. But an attempt to try and move on from democratic norms to authoritarian norms to dictatorial norms and to Bonapartism. Trump was moving towards a Bonapartist outcome, and he was being able to develop I wouldn't say a vibrant base, but certainly quite a strong base. And that's gone quite deep, because among the construction workers that I've met, I mean, they're solid Trump. That's a solid Trump rump, and they're not déclasse. I mean, they're people who get up early and work hard and all the rest of it, but there they are. But it's quite a mixed bunch. But there is a mood of right, but none of them would ever accept a non-union wage. None of them. They all aspire to a union wage. You talk about a union job. Everyone says, I want a union job. So, unions, despite the fact that they're just a fragment, just a small slice of the working class or organized, that norm, that idea that you have to have a union job is deeply embedded into the American working class consciousness. And that I want to return to later on. So we've seen this attempt to reunite the working class, the ruling class and its norms on which it applies. And it's in my view, it's failing. It's kind of weak, but at least that's one of the sides of the situation. But now we're moving into another situation where we've got rising inflation back to back to the 1980s, where we had really high inflation. Plus, we see, particularly in relation to the fossil fuel, an attempt, can I say, an inextricably bound up system of capitalism and the oil industry, which is going through a massive resurgence in its political strength. Unbelievable. Although the words are all blah, 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 and we're moving on towards to a green economy and all the rest of it. And even around me, I can see that the solar panels are rising. Actually, on day-to-day experiences, that's $5 a gallon, for petrol, for gas, and that people are really grumbling about it. Every place I go to, people are really grumbling. So that is the basis on which anti-democratic base, for Trump to be able to say, look, the Democrats are I'm representing the oil sector. We can make a deal for you, but those people are trying to reform society, trying to move away from fossil fuels, are talking all this nonsense about climate change. I'll put a fist in their face and bring back the oil sector into total dominance politically again. So there's, there are big political struggles out there, and it's going to be quite dramatic. At the moment, if I go down to the supermarket, there are about 7 adverts for jobs. Urgent, urgent, urgent. There's no butcher in the local supermarket. They can't find somebody to do that. In CVS, that is the main pharmacy here, there's even approached me to ask me if I was ready to stand in. It's incredible. So in other words, it's a society which has had, you can't say it had a boom, but it's had 3.5% unemployment, one almost historic low levels of unemployment on the basis of massive expenditure. But that massive expenditure has now led inexorably towards high inflation. And the answer is that the American ruling class and the financial sector is having for its own security to bring in a recession. And it's going to be quite conscious that they are talking now of reducing spending, and the Reserve Bank, or the Federal Reserve, actually raising 3 interest rates of 50 points, that's 0.5%, 3 times 3, in the next 6 months, or less actually, by September. And that will bring a reversal in terms of all the, the hope in terms of inflation. But on the other hand, it can't, because actually we see that the fossil fuel industry, the oil sector, is rising high. Even if you put interest rates high, unless you absolutely crush the demand for gas, for petrol, which you can't do without causing a catastrophe in transport, those prices are going to remain high. And that is and then we'll eventually see a rising unemployment, that 3.5% rising to 6 and 7 and 8%. And then the Democrats actually really being in deep crisis, in the unions, treachery to be able to support the Democratic Party now all becoming evident, and sections of the working class, quite frankly, we have to say it, moving over to Trump. It's dreadful, but it's the fact. So we're looking, but with all those dismal facts, I'm optimistic about the states. Why? Because there is a democratic tradition. When I talk to young women, there's a fierce opposition to everything which the Supreme Court is trying to impose, and a real hatred for Trump. It runs deep. So it's not just that all of society is drifting to the right. It's far from the case. It's deep polarization, as we've discussed in the past. And we're seeing now with this rapid rise, which has to come with a recession in unemployment, we're going to see a return to the unions, a return to struggle. And as we've seen in quite remarkable way, all kinds of new ideas being brought to unionize new sectors of workers, and for young workers to turn towards trade unions and to be able to return to rebuilding the labor movement as we've seen in the 1930s. It won't be exactly the same as the 1930s, but it will be fierce, because after having a very low unemployment level, now we're going to see a catastrophic or a rapid rise in unemployment. And that's going to spur on the workers to actually get into defense and even aggression, be able to move forward confidently and building a new society with a workers' party somewhere in people's minds, because they've been let down by every bourgeois party, as we would have expected, and the lessons are now being learned. So thank you, Jack.
Yep, thank you, David. It struck me while you were speaking how similar the situation is in Britain in many respects. We will be discussing that in the near future. Ian, your turn.
Hi, I'd just like to ask a quick question about the organized left in the United States. With what seemed like a couple of years ago, some left breakthroughs in the Democrat Party. Bernie Sanders for a time looked like he'd be the candidate. AOC inspired a lot of enthusiasm, though I've also seen a lot of stuff from her more recently that sometimes comes across as word salads, as often described. That's not to say she doesn't still do anything right, going to picket lines and the like, but this policy of integration into the Democrats also seems to be running up against real barriers. There were 57 votes against massively funding continued war in Ukraine. Not one of them was a Democrat. They were all Trumpish Republicans. The whole of the squad and Bernie fell into line on that very important issue of war and peace. There seems to be a real divergence in a lot of what had been the Bernie Sanders coalition. On the one hand, you've got people like the Young Turks, see sometimes videos from them on Facebook that just uncritically regurgitate stuff from Jen Psaki. It's mad. They're just mainstream Democrats, at least some of the time. And then there's a kind of ex-left, I've seen it described, around people like Tulsi Gabbard, who are better on foreign policy, on anti-imperialism, but almost as a point of principle as to not get too integrated into the Biden administration. They feel the need to minimize what happened with Trump, that January 6th wasn't a big deal, and to suggest otherwise is somehow a betrayal of bigger deals abroad. Personally, I'm against fascistic coups, whether it's in a failed one in America in 2021 or one that succeeded in Ukraine in 2014. It's amazing how few people can oppose both of those things at the same time, it seems sometimes, on the left. So what I'm really asking, I suppose, is the subjective factor, what the state of the left is, both in those kind of key figures, but also organizationally, the growth of DSA, and also, I guess, what the chances are of another campaign like the two we've had from Bernie. For a while, I thought the natural next step would be someone like AOC or like Tulsi Gabbard, both of whom seem to have gone off in slightly different directions since. I did see an otherwise very depressing article on Kamala Harris that just made it look like Trump was going to win, if that's the best the other side have got. It was mentioned in passing that Bernie Sanders hasn't totally ruled out, at least himself, running again, which I think might still be the best chance we've got to represent the left broadly in that kind of a challenge. But maybe it'll have to come from totally left field, the way Trump came from outside of politics, and seems to be able to channel the rage of people, even though his solutions are the opposite of what's needed, the absolute opposite in most cases, except for maybe not wanting to escalate too much with Russia. But he does seem to be able to channel the rage by acting unconventionally within politics in a way that really appeals to a section of people, whereas the left breakthrough much more has seemed to try and make peace with Biden, influence a bit from the sidelines, and drop a lot of its principles. So if there's any way of getting back from that, or any way of breaking in from somewhere else, because otherwise it will just be a fight between Trump and a hopeless centrist mess, and I don't think the hopeless centrist mess has much chance of winning.
All right.
Do you want me to answer
you.
that, or should I wait?
Sorry?
Do you want me to answer that, or should I wait? I don't care.
Could you wait? There's one or two people in the queue.
I don't. Yeah, sure.
Okay, it's up to you, Jack, if you want to come in now.
No. I just assume I do want to answer that, but maybe someone else will.
Okay, you come in now.
I'll wait. Let
All
the
right.
other people speak.
Okay. Well, next, welcome Eric, a comrade of ours from California over a long period.
Thank you. And thank you, as always, Roger, for hosting these. It's a special treat for me. I've started to work graveyards, and so I'm not often up this early in the morning. And it's wonderful to get to hear Jack give a talk. Actually, Jack and I only live about a mile away from each other, and I always enjoy his talks. Thanks, Jack. I won't go on and on and on, but there's a couple of things I wanted to get into. And first, I want to respond specifically to the last comrade that spoke. I missed his name. His accent sounded Scottish to me. And about DSA, I had tremendous hope in DSA initially, and I joined. And I think that Jack was a little more jaundiced on it right away. He sort of saw through a lot of it. It's very large. A ton of particularly young people came in and joined. And it is so ineffective. It's unbelievable. There are a number of different currents in it, some of which are worth paying attention to, many of which are not. And so it's kind of been sucked into being this kind of parallel thing to the Democratic Party, with lots of union staffers and sort of liberal academics sort of dominating, and better currents try to do things, and they're squashed by what I guess you'd probably describe as like reformists or right reformists that dominate the organization writ large. So there are tens of thousands of members that are what are called paper members, because you go in, you try to get something done, and you're just blocked at every step. So there's some wonderful people here in the Bay Area, in San Francisco Bay Area, who do their own initiatives and are technically members of DSA, but the initiatives they do are sort of separate from DSA. And that sometimes is in concert with another important current in American society that I don't exactly know how to frame. Maybe Jack has a better title for this, but there's this kind of left, Black and indigenous, minority, nationalist sort of consciousness that do some good direct action things. Here about a year and a half ago, maybe a little longer, there was an occupation by some moms of a vacant home. There's tons of real estate being bought up in the United States by private corporations as there are bankruptcies and things. Big pockets of money, capital come in and buy them up and either flip them, put them back on the market for a profit, or rent them to great profit. And often they sit empty. We'll have homeless people. They're parts of American cities. Here, San Francisco Bay Area, the highest concentration of billionaires on the planet, the home of tech, of high tech, right here. And you wouldn't believe the poverty in our downtowns. It's like it could be India or someplace. Tent cities, and it's just horrible, you know. As Jack already alluded, you know, we lost our social services really in any effective way a couple of decades ago here in the U.S. I've lost the point. DSA, yeah, neoliberalism. What I wanted to say was, okay, so I'm a skilled worker. I work at a public utility, and I've taken on some trade union work. I've beat my head against the wall. I've never succeeded at a whole lot, but I've had the opportunity to debate and discuss with American workers a lot. And many of them have been pulled into this right-wing Trump orbit with kind of confused ideas, kind of a class consciousness mixed with some very backward ideas, some racist ideas, and nationalistic, xenophobic ideas. And on the other hand, some that would be more our kind of New Deal, what used to be called New Deal Democrat, kind of liberal. If they were in Europe or some other place in the world, Latin America, somewhere, they would probably be in some social democratic party, the Labor Party or something like that. And of course, they're very frightened by the Trump movement. Intuitively, they don't like it. But this is kind of the choice that American working class people face, because the left is just lost. We've got the old established left, Trotskyist or Stalinist, that can't get out of little sectarian squabbles, is incredibly ineffective. Now there's DSA. There's this attempt to form a kind of old, like, socialist party, reformist thing. I haven't given up on it completely, but so far it's just a dud. There are actually some members of it. You mentioned AOC. I think there are 4 at this point, members of Congress that are technically members of DSA, will occasionally give a little lip service to socialism. But really what they're talking about is some very mild stuff, progressive taxation, and they'll trumpet war initiatives. Recently, there was a scandal. One of them was backing this initiative to sell arms to Israel. I mean, it's just not good. You know, they really aren't an alternative for working class Americans. But what I found to be successful, just myself, you know, I don't have a journal to hand people. I occasionally give people things to read I know about, or I point toward articles on the internet, but you know, it isn't really an organization I feel good about right now. But what I argue for is a little different programmatically, and this is opening maybe a whole topic, and probably most of you are much better read than I, but I argue for a more of a kind of a partial program. Say, yeah, what I learned in CWI years ago when I was a member, you talk about the commanding heights. Hey, things like Amazon, come on, that should be a part of a public mail delivery system or big ticket items, but we don't want to hurt the petty bourgeois. I mean, I don't put it that way. But and I've rarely argued against the most reactionary workers, because I can always get them to go, well, yeah, that kind of makes sense. That's a good idea, you know. And I can also point to the fact that it's fairly easy. I work for a public utility, little pocket of socialism. Worked for the water agency here of the urban part, the east part of the Bay Area. And so we can point to go, look, this is some socialism, and it's really successful. But you know, like around these questions of rent, like some of the young activists, some of the better ones here have taken on, like, trying to form tenants unions and things. And I was trying to make the point, look, you don't want to margin. This is talking to people that are already imbued with left ideas. You don't want to attack the petty bourgeois. You need, if you programmatically, they'll put things like, we should smash all landlords. I think, well, okay, that's great for you young activists, but you're going to scare off most working class people. Some of them have an aunt or an uncle that might own a duplex or something. So you want to try to, you don't go after the petty, you want to neutralize the petty bourgeois. So our things we put forward, I think, need to have that framing that, yeah, we want big ticket public ownership, but we're not after lots of little businesses. In fact, we want to protect them, give them breaks on taxes, control their rents, promise them reasonable access to credit. I mean, these are actually things I remember reading in CWI literature years ago. But I mean, that's kind of what you hear from the left here in the US, and why part of why it's so ineffective, there are other reasons, is just this massive maximalist program, smash capitalism. Doesn't appeal to working class people. They want stability. They want a transition to something that'll work in their life that's stable. Anyway, I don't want to rant on and on. Thank you so much for holding these, Roger. And I look forward to hearing Jack's sum up. Thank you.
Eric, it's a real pleasure to hear from you. And do, even if it means getting up early, do please participate as often as you can, okay? Right, Comrade Dominic, then Ed.
John. It's Comrade John.
Oh, sorry, John. Sorry, John.
I've heard Jack's explanation, what's happening in America around the education field. For many years, I've been a school governor, and I still am, in Manchester. And over the years, the one good thing that came out of America, as far as I was concerned, to do with education, was a thing called the Sure Start initiative. I think it came from either Massachusetts or Boston. And basically it was a whole parenting thing, holistic parenting thing for, very young children in nurseries. Needless to say, the Tories have got rid of it because it was actually doing something, for the working class. But the one thing that comes over to what you've been saying, and also the experience we're having here in Britain, is this sort of, not a zombieism, but a sort of, we can't do anything about it. Capitalism has been there ever since Adam was a boy, and capitalism will be there to the end of the world. And the reality is, if we look back 40 years ago, particularly here in Britain, then you had things like decent public housing. In terms of, I think over 50% of housing in Britain was actually social housing, where there was, a reasonable level of expectation that council estates were, good places to live, and that's all gone now. There's ever since Thatcher, and it was under Blair as well. So it was Labour and Tory having that joint thing of allowing council houses to be sold off. We now have a situation where here in Britain, there are attacks on the education system. But because over the last couple of decades, the education system has been broken up, schools have got more independence. There is a thing which is academies, which I think you have a different name in America, but these are now large private corporations with as many as 60 to 70, 80 schools. So they're not just localized private enterprise things. And one of the most disgusting things that came out here in the last week was the fact that one of the areas of education in Britain that is in real crisis is special education, where young boys and girls are taken into care, and it is presented as being in crisis because there's no money there. But what came out last week is that two major companies were literally making millions of pounds profit out of the education system for these children in care. And these children in care safeguarding is out the window. They've got paedophiles on the staff, etc. And I think what is common to America and to Britain is to really fight for the fact that things haven't always been the same since Adam was a boy, that there were periods of, all right, there were reform, but there were periods when utilities were publicly owned, where housing was a service and not just a profit-making organization. And I think as far as America's concerned, you know, I think myself that there is seeds looking there. I think particularly with young people, the disgust that's coming through of gun ownership and massacres in schools. One of the brightest ones I thought was in Florida last year, where the school students, I thought for one period, were going to actually try and take on the establishment in Florida, because they, you know, they suffered a massacre and that got a real echo. So I'll leave it at that. It's just that thing, the real battle is to say that capitalism is out, it's greed, it's profit, and they couldn't give a damn. And the reality is there have been better periods in our recent history, and there have been times in our history when there's been some, if you like, vision of a future that would, if you like, get rid of capitalism. So I'll leave it there.
Right, thank you, John. Thanks very much. Ed.
Well, thank you very much, Jack, for your contribution, and also Eric. You know, very, very interesting to hear comrades on the ground. And most of what I've got to say is questions, because I'm not on the ground in the USA. But one or two observations. In some ways, the American ruling class is the most ignorant of all ruling classes in the world. Its whole acquisition of domination in North America is based on sort of lies and genocide and fabrication of myths and so on. And yet the population, the downtrodden population of America, the working people, the ex-slaves, the blacks and so on, are amongst the most, I mean, being the most oppressed in society, are amongst the most creative and brilliant contributors to the culture of our planet. You know, you have jazz, you have blues, you have reggae, you have all kinds of initiatives that have spread all over the world, but originated from the most downtrodden sections of society in the United States. And I visited America in early 2017, and what I saw then, this was the very beginning of the Trump administration, was a very highly politicized society. I went on a huge march in New Orleans of mostly women protesting against the threat to women's rights that Trump's administration posed. You know, we've seen huge sort of strikes and protests like the Black Lives Matter movement more recently. That's one of my questions, actually. I mean, I'd like to know what's happened, what's come out of the Black Lives Matter movement, where its activists are going and have gone. We see this is another of my questions. We see the initiatives that young people are taking around gun control and absolutely refusing to accept the diktats of the establishment, that there's nothing that can be done about it. So, you know, there is, I mean, I also remember being on a bus from one of the airports in New York into the city center. This was a week or two after Trump had taken the presidency. And most of the people on the bus were fairly young, like in their 30s. It was an airport bus, and this elderly woman in her 70s got up in the front of the bus and made a speech to everyone on the bus about how important it is that everyone becomes political, because we can't just sit here and let a fascist president take over the country. And, you know, these young people on the bus were quite sort of startled and amazed that an elderly woman could get up and make it. And it wasn't a political meeting, it was a bus, but it turned into a political meeting. So, you know, I'm talking about a society where the politics of the left is not particularly successfully organized, but underneath the surface, there are a lot of what you could call people who are inclined to move in a left direction, if only they could find the sort of the organization through which to express that. So I've thrown in a couple of questions already, a couple of more questions just before I finish. Under the Obama administration, there were some attempts to introduce a better public healthcare system. And as I understand it, most of those attempts were sort of stymied by the right wing, they were thwarted by the establishment. Can you tell me what the state of play is with, you know, public healthcare for the poorest in society? And the other question is concerning the fragments of what's left of the CWI in America. Kshama Sawant, who, from what I've seen on the internet, has tried to do some quite good work as a counselor in Seattle. And, you know, can you tell me if that's making any headway, and are there movements like that that can begin to be the seeds of something significant and successful on the left? Thank you, that's it.
Just one little point. I understand that Kshama Sawant is no longer with the CWI. She was part of the split, but
yeah, I should have included that, Roger. Yes, yeah.
Look, there's nobody else actually indicated they want to speak, but I would like to invite Steve Zeltzer, if he's still here, who is really would have a wealth of information about the mood in the working class and the struggles of trade union struggles. Are you there, Steve? And are you ready to speak?
Yeah, I'm here. I mean,
Okay.
I thanks for Jack's presentation, and Jack has obviously the most knowledgeable view of what's going on in education because of his being a teacher and also fighting the capitalist control of the education system supported by the union bureaucracy, who are implementing these the agenda, capitalist agenda in education. But what I wanted to add is, I mean, I think for revolutionaries, I mean, in the United States and internationally, is the question of the United Front. There is no Labor Party in the United States, and we need to unite around class issues that can unite workers. So most importantly, and Jack is involved in it, there's a political development in the Bay Area called the Schools and Labor Against Privatization, SLAP, which actually came out of a struggle that we did to fight the privatization of the Port of Oakland, which was going to threaten the longshore workers and teachers, the attack on public education. So this united front, bringing together these unions and these workers, I think is an important vehicle for uniting the struggle around against privatization, which I see as critical task in the working class. I think that the other thing that I wanted to add is you can't really look at what's going on with the decline of US imperialism without discussing the rise of fascism in the United States. There's an organized rise of fascism. In fact, you have a section of the capitalist class, and everybody's been watching these hearings, that want a dictatorship. The last attempted coup in the United States was Smedley Butler, who some capitalists tried to organize for a coup against Roosevelt. But and that was in the 30s. But what you have now is you have a sizable a significant section, not the majority, but a significant section of the capitalist class that want a different form of rule in the United States. And you've got Fox from Murdoch and a political campaign to get rid of bourgeois democracy. And right now there's the AFL-CIO convention going on, and we just had an event of this group called Labor Education Project on AFL-CIO International Operations. But there was a resolution by the Vermont AFL-CIO calling for one, a democratic structure in the AFL-CIO, where they rank and file can elect the leadership of the AFL-CIO, and two, that the AFL-CIO prepare for a general strike against another possible coup or insurrection in the United States. And the AFL-CIO leadership ruled that out of order, tabled it, both resolutions. They don't want a discussion about the political crisis, the social crisis, even though that's right on TV, these hearings that are going on in the United States about how this coup and insurrection, attempted coup and insurrection were planned and organized to overthrow the constitutional process and prevent the certification of the vote. So I think a united front against fascism is critical, but I think there's a political vacuum. And as I think some of you know, I'm part of this United Front Committee for a Labor Party, which was set up to fight for a Labor Party, and to do that in the context of fighting for united fronts around class issues that can unite workers who have different points of view, but want to fight against privatization, want to fight against fascism, want to fight to defend public education. So I see that as a method or a means of organizing the working class. As to the left, I agree that the largest left group is in the DSA, and I think that 100,000, and I think that what do you fight for in the DSA? That's a question if you're in the DSA. And I think you have to fight for a united front approach against privatization, for a Labor Party, a real independent working class Labor Party. And there's a fight in the DSA. Some people want to leave it because they say it's a reformist leadership, which it has, but there are a large number of people who've joined the DSA who can be won to the idea of a Labor Party and a fight in the unions. The last point is, I think there's no way of getting around the trade union bureaucracy in the United States. And I've said that before. You have a pro-imperialist, pro-capitalist trade union bureaucracy, which has a grip on their structure. That's the organized working class. And there has to be a fight in the trade unions against this trade union bureaucracy around class issues and education around what's needed politically. And I think that that's growing because there's a great deal of anger and frustration. One of the reasons this formation has come out, this SLAP group, is the anger and frustration of teachers in Oakland who are fed up with the collaboration of the CTA OAA leadership, and Jack can talk about this, with the capitalists, refusal to fight, refusal to unite all the workers, education workers in California against charters, against privatization. So there's a growing potential in the working class for a political alternative. And I think that the reason that the trade union bureaucracy is terrified of discussing a general strike is because in the midst of the greatest social crisis, I would say, in the history of the United States, there's never been an attempted coup by a sizable section of the capitalists in the United States. There's a social political crisis. The idea of a mobilization of the working class is the most dangerous thing for this trade union bureaucracy. They're terrified a general strike could open everything up, which it would. And I think we should educate and talk about the general strike. There was a general strike in San Francisco, and in Oakland with 1946 was the last one. But that's the kind of action to fight this onslaught. The last point is the Republicans are going to take probably Congress and may take the presidency. And when that happens, you're going to have a very volatile, radical situation. If people think it's bad in the United States now, if the Republicans take over Congress and take over the executive, you could have massacres every day. I mean, you literally have thousands and thousands of these right-wingers, young right-wingers, fascists, who are going to shoot. They are shooting. So we're facing a very dangerous, volatile, explosive situation. And the only, as I think most of you would agree, people that can solve that, the only element that can solve it is the working class organized politically, which it is not. So I think, but we can say that that's what's coming and get ready. And the amazing thing is that most of the left is, I think, asleep at the wheel. Most of the left don't even take seriously the danger of a dictatorship in the United States and what that would mean in the United States. And that is a real problem. The left is asleep, and there's not a serious analysis of why we're in a social crisis and why we may have a dictatorship in the United States, a fascist regime or a semi-fascist regime. And that is not even debated in the left, which shows the disconnect really with the reality of the situation in the United States. That's it.
Oh, all right. Thank you, Steve. Are there any other comrades who want to come in before I ask Jack to come back? Any questions, any points that any comrades want to make? It doesn't have to be a sort of comprehensive contribution, just a question or a quick point. If not, okay, Jack.
Yeah, so first, I want to say that when I said I was drained, and I did not really, I couldn't even envision sitting down and trying to plan a talk the way I usually do. So I'm going to try to make some points now because that I didn't make in the opening that I think need to be made. I'll respond to some of the questions and comments as well. The first point is that I think that it's critical to understand the US, which is very difficult to do unless you've been here for some time. I've been on those buses at numerous times from JFK, and all I got were cramps in my legs from sitting for an hour and a half to 2 hours while they sat at Kennedy waiting for someone to pick them up, and then played episodes of Seinfeld were dominating. So it's not that what you found isn't there, but you know, the US is a vast country, which you can find many different things in many different areas at many different times. But one thing which wasn't brought up and should be much more is the relation between violence in the US and the legacy from slavery and from the defeat of Reconstruction and from Jim Crow. And that racism is there. You have a mixed consciousness among, I think, many in the US in the Rust Belt, people who are following Trump. And Trump basically gives a clarion call, enabler of racism. But you have people who in other times work with and collaborate with and even organize with white workers and black workers working together. But as things break down, and they're breaking down badly, we see in the US, as we see in so many different countries, a fragmentation and people reverting to some of the worst types of behaviors out of fear and out of the fact that there isn't a solution that appears to be a solution that moves things forward. And so you're familiar with it in the UK with Brexit and the division between, I remember Julian, Roger's brother, taking me around the London area and saying, you know, it's not like this in most of the country. We have two countries here. We have London and the southeast, and then we have the north and the Midland. They're very different. Well, the U.S. has more than two. It's not just the blue states and the red states. In the urban areas, the high poverty, mainly black and brown areas, are quite different from the other areas. And the violence now also has to be related to the fact that the U.S. is the biggest arms dealer in the world. You know, look at what the U.S. is shipping to Ukraine now, and where are those arms going to go? Well, you can't separate, you know, that the U.S. is a very violent, a very violent society, and you can't separate it from its entire history, from the genocide of the Native Americans through slavery and so on. So we have to keep that in mind. Now, what's happening, and which also wasn't touched on, is that Ed asked about Black Lives Matter. I can't go into things fully, but there's a backlash that's occurring. It's occurring at different levels in different places. In San Francisco, the district attorney, Chesa Boudin, who's the son of two weather people, Dave Gilbert, who's in jail for life, and Kathy Boudin, and who was raised by two other more prominent ones, or better known ones, I should say, Bernardine Dohrn and Bill Ayers, was the district attorney in San Francisco who was just defeated in a recall election in a reaction against his policies, which were basically to have more of a rehabilitation and less of a punishment attitude, towards incarceration and legal enforcement. That was funded very heavily by right-wing billionaires from San Francisco and the Silicon Valley, despite the fact that crime actually lowered. The statistics show there was a decrease. There's a backlash that's going on. The conditions in the cities, Eric alluded to this, I think, are horrendous now. The homeless people, first of all, homelessness has increased dramatically. There's a huge housing crisis. You have working people living out of their cars. There are no or very few toilet facilities, running water, and so on provided for homeless people. In almost every freeway on-ramp or off-ramp or overpass in Oakland, you have little tent cities, and then you have huge ones in a few locations. In the conditions that that we're living in the past, most violence was overwhelmingly confined to the ghetto areas. Gang fights. The repercussions of drug dealing, and so on. Now you have a breakout of street crime where you have more incidents occurring in more affluent areas, and you're getting a real pushback. There's a push towards vigilantism, I think, is coming. Where people are, saying, someone was just robbed at gunpoint in front of my house, or someone threw a flower pot through the house next door, or and so on. There's a group fear mentality. This is incidents like this build support for individuals like Trump. This is occurring in urban areas as well. Unless there's a positive solution that's put forward, and it's not going to come from Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, then unless there's a mass solution, then we're all going to be in grave trouble here. But there's another aspect to the U.S. and its history, which is that episodically it's punctuated by huge upsurges, mass movements that no one sees coming. In 1933-34, who saw the labor upsurge coming then? In retrospect, you can say, well, there was the Railway Labor Act, and there was Gastonia, textile organizing, but no one saw that tremendous upsurge, which drove, which drove all the reforms that occurred in the 30s were driven by that, not by Roosevelt. It didn't come down from Roosevelt. It came up from the mass movements. And that forced the hand of labor, and it forced a bureaucrat like John L. Lewis to step out, and lead a split with the craft unions to form the CIO, the Congress Industrial Organizations. Look at Occupy, just 10 years ago. Who saw that coming? Yet you had this tremendous world-changing movement. I think that's coming again. But the question for us is, when it comes, if it doesn't break through to world revolution and recedes, how do we retain some organized form? How do we retain the best of the people there, learn lessons, and be able to build for the future, organizationally? Because we know that that's coming. We can look even at the red state teacher strikes, and we didn't see those coming. But there's something we can learn from that, which is There were 4 or 5 of them, but even with 4 or 5 states, they were going to be isolated. They need support. Where are they going to get financial support? Where are they going to get organizing advice from, and so on? Well, they turned to Labor Notes and the Labor Notes Network, and people, which is at least at best a mixed bag. You have some, some real decent people there, and you have a lot of out bureaucrats and people who are, are looking for a more moderate approach. But that's where people are going to turn. And Labor Notes is going to have a conference this summer in Chicago. Their last conferences were their biggest, and they had 2,000 people. They're going to have 4,000 people this year, maybe more. They already have advanced registration of 4,000. So to try to we're going to see that there are places where you can attempt to build. I think Steve is right about the need to build a united front, but how do you build it? Not from the death rattle of the old left organizations. I think that it's going to come from these upsurges, and you're going to have organizers from Amazon and Starbucks are going to be appearing at there and elsewhere, and we have to try to to somehow connect with the best of them in some organized form. On charter schools, the Chicago Teachers Union, which I have many criticisms of, but one thing which they're doing, I've been told, and if it's true, it's a way to go, is to, when charter schools are organized, it seems to me, one, we want to make sure as much as possible that the basis they're organized on is the same basis as public schools, the same wages, the same working conditions, the same due process, and so on. If those occurred, then there wouldn't be a need for these charter schools, or what John says called academies. And yes, we have these huge archipelagos, chains of charter schools. The corporate charter schools will dominate here too, John. And that's one. The other is that what's being put in place there, I've been told, is the stipulation that that there'll be a moratorium, no more charter schools, and when a charter school is organized, that there's a horizon, a sunset for it being a charter school, that it will revert over time to being a public school. So I think that that is, I'm raising that not so much to go back to specifically talking about education, as talk about the constituent parts that can lead to, and I believe will be part of, a moving forward and possibly a new upsurge. What we need to do is to understand that when these occur, as long as they remain isolated, the labor bureaucracy is going to do what it always does. The red state teachers turned to Labor Notes. What they got, though, really was an influx of staff from the national and state unions to draw them back into line, to tell them, end your strikes and don't do it again, and tamp things down. And that's the message. It may not be in those bold, direct terms, but that's the message that's that's coming through very clearly. And a couple of final things. One is, when Biden was elected, I actually thought that there would be a big emphasis on rebuilding the infrastructure, and there would be an opportunity out of that to build a left wing and so on. He had the Build Back Better program. Jacobin, which is hardly a flaming revolutionary publication, mainly left social democratic, they have a special issue, just came out 2 days ago, on infrastructure. And the main theme is that Build Back Better has become Build Back Never. Bernie, AOC, and so on, by attaching themselves to the Democratic Party in the way they do, wind up, when push comes to shove, falling in line behind the Democratic Party and actually bringing more people into it. We see that all the time in the Bay Area with individuals like Barbara Lee, before her Ron Dellums and so on, who themselves speak left, but appear with the more moderate candidates and say, you must vote for this one, and are used to damp things down and keep things moderate. Ron Dellums, who had this great reputation nationally, Ron Dellums became mayor of Oakland. during the state takeover of schools. I can tell you, because I was quite active in the teacher union and community education movements at the time, did zero, nothing. We confronted him numerous times on it. We've gotten zero help from Barbara Lee in that regard, and so on. So these people look good and make great statements, but their trajectory is always towards the center and to accommodate to the Democratic Party. AOC has great PR, and she's an attractive woman who really knows how to present her image. People looking to, if there's anything that comes out, it's going to come from below, pushing things forward. And these people will try to ride it. And I'm not saying that, you know, that it's out of the question to be critically supporting them at times. I am saying that there needs to be an independent movement, and only with that, and it will come as it comes. We can't call it into existence. We know it's coming, and we need to prepare, I think, for how we're going to react towards it. So I think that I will. I guess add in terms of Obama's healthcare program was, was is really a handout to, to the healthcare industry. What you're getting is a dominance under it of health maintenance organizations, HMOs, which are actually being used to attempt to unravel Medicare, which is the only real national health care for those 65 and over, and try to convince people from Medicare to go for what's called senior advantage en masse, which is going to be a privatization of healthcare, in which the national healthcare system is unraveled to the health insurers. The fact that the Republicans want to make it worse doesn't make this good. I'm going to stop there.
Okay. Well, look, thank you very much, Jack, and thanks to everybody who participated. I think it's been one of the most interesting and stimulating discussions we've had, quite a dynamic discussion. It was balanced, it showed a clear light on all the forces and processes, both positive and negative, that are taking place in US society. This is usually the point at which I'm asked to give news about the next meeting. So what I can tell you is I can tell you about the next two meetings of WIN. The only thing I can't tell you is which order they'll come in, for reasons which I don't need to go into now. But one is on the crisis in Britain, which has actually a lot of parallels with the crisis, both politically and socially and economically in the USA. We want to go into the discussion of that crisis. Of course, everybody is aware of the political crisis, the fact that the current government is really hanging just by a thread, but also for the first time for really a decade, in some ways more than that, a beginning of a movement of the trade unions. So we're having the first mass trade union demonstration in just less than a week from now, the first for at least a decade. And we've also got the biggest strike for several decades, really, with the rail strike, which is starting in a few days' time. So in that situation, we want to discuss the crisis in British society, and we're hoping to invite a major trade union activist to speak or to contribute. The other meeting which we're planning is we decided that over a period that we would have an occasional series on the history of the international workers' movement. And the first of those would be a discussion about the early years of Marx and Engels, and then leading up to the creation of the First International. And Comrade Ed would be leading off on that question. So either way, please watch this space, watch the for your emails, and you'll get notice of which of those two meetings is taking place a week today. So I'd like to thank all the comrades who contributed and to thank all the comrades for their attendance. It's been a very good meeting. Thanks very much and goodbye.
Thanks, everyone.